What's up, everybody? It's Mark Bylock, and today we're going to talk about Canada's most celebrated whiskey for 2018, the Canadian Club 41-year-old. They call this the Chronicles, and this is going to be actually one of many. Apparently, every year they're going to release a new one. So next year we'll have the 42 and the 43. Eventually, we'll have 50, I assume. This also complements the Canadian Club 40-year-old that came around. Now, Canadian Club is one of those brands that has, it's pretty much in every bar in the entire world. But this is very much a premier whiskey. It's $300 Canadian. It's mostly only available at the LCBO, and this is so far won Jim Murray's Best Whiskey of the Year for 2019. Best Canadian Whiskey of the Year. It placed ridiculously well in the Canadian Whiskey Awards, which I was a judge of. It also ranked really highly in kind of the whiskeys that I like. But before we get to the whiskey, which by the way is fantastic, can we do an unboxing? Because this is really nice. Like if Apple employees had designed this box, I wouldn't be surprised. So it looks like a normal box. You're kind of not sure how to open it. It has like a bit of a thing there where you think, oh, maybe that's where it opens. But it actually, just make sure the camera focuses in, it actually has this like magnetic strip. So you literally plop it open. It just opens this much. The bag comes in a wonderful bag, and there's your bottle. Now, this is actually, if you look at the color, it's ridiculously light colored, and I didn't actually buy this, and my mom bought this for me for Christmas, which is really nice. Last year I got a $30 bottle, so I don't know what I did to deserve this bottle, but I ranked it ridiculously well. Look at this etching in the back. Like, that's really, really nice. The cork is really nice. It has this like rope around it. Really, really gorgeous as far as the bottle and the print and everything else. They did a great job with this one, as they did last year as well. Now, it comes with this nice little bag, which, I mean, I could give or take, but hey, free bags, right? So the whiskey scored ridiculously well. When I judged it in the Canadian Whiskey Awards, it was one of my favorites of the list. So I judged it completely blind with a very similar score to how I judged it knowing what it was, and that was a score of 94. I really enjoyed this whiskey, primarily because it reminded me a little bit of a single malt Scotch. Now, Canadian whiskey and single malt Scotch really have nothing in common, at least not anything coming out of Hiram Walker right now, primarily because Canadian whiskey is mostly made out of corn and maybe a little bit of rye. Single malt Scotch, of course, made of 100% malted barley, so not really the same starting substance. But because this whiskey has been aged for 41 years, there is a similar flavor profile from the perspective of these like really lemon candied notes that you'll get in a lot of old single malt Scotches. So it's just a wonderful kind of hard candy note that I got like lemon notes, but it's really terrific. And just nosing it and tasting it reminds me of that whiskey, of an old single malt Scotch. But this isn't a single malt Scotch. It is mostly corn-based. Most Canadian whiskey is made out of corn. However, Canada has something called the 909 rule, which means that Canadian whiskey can have, first of all, Canadian whiskey by definition needs to be at least 3 years old to be defined as a whiskey, and needs to be aged in barrels. It can't be aged in any other sort of wood product. I mean, like bourbon's a good example. You can basically age bourbon in a bucket and call it bourbon. This one, Canadian whiskey does have strict regulations that way, but because the 909 rule, which is really there from a traditional standpoint, Canadian distributors can add a little bit of sherry or cognac. They can even add a spirit that's 2 years aged in oak or older. So you can have this with a little bit of young rye, which I think they've actually done. They have said that they've added a little bit of sherry, a little bit of cognac, but based on that color, I wouldn't say that they added a lot. I would say that there's barely any cognac or sherry in here. I was also told that the whiskey was aged in largely saturated rye barrels. By saturated, that means that they didn't have basically a lot of the flavor has been taken from those barrels, so they didn't really contribute a lot in flavor. So it's really intended as a blender's playhouse to see how this will blend. So with a little bit of sherry, a little bit of cognac, probably added a little bit of color. But what I really get on this, because on the nose you'll get that sweetness, you get that brown sugar sweetness. But what I really get from it is the rye. The young rye really comes through, and that's really nice. It's when you have an old whiskey, sometimes it can taste like old and musty and just a little unpleasant or certainly uncomfortably old, essentially. But adding in a little bit of young rye makes this more of a vibrant whiskey. So I'm going to go through my tasting notes here, just on the thing. So on the nose, I got brown sugar, malted barley, Kind of again malted barley. There's no malted barley in here, but it just was very reminiscent of malted barley. Our hard lemon candy. I got some brief char notes the first time I poured it. It wasn't overpowering, but there were some caramel notes to it. And like this is obviously there's some sherry in here. Like you can kind of get that those sherry notes, but it's nice and intense and complex, which is what I'm looking for in a great drink. On the palate, as a lemon zesty, tart, buttery. Like it's kind of like that black. Sort of like a tart, buttery tart. Black pepper spice is terrific, and that must come from that young rye. Really wonderful sweetness. It's buttery, oily, peppery, like really a wonderful amount of flavor to it, and really intense. And I could see why it's done so well on the show. So yeah, I did get a sample bottle, and that's what I'm reading the notes from. I didn't buy a bottle of this one, but I did receive one, as mentioned here. I highly recommend this whiskey, but for $300, it is really hard to recommend it to everybody. If you're working on a whiskey collection and this is a price range you're very comfortable with, go for it and buy this whiskey. I don't think you'll regret it. If you rarely buy whiskey at this price point, I would say you're fine. You can probably taste it at a bar somewhere at some point or from a friend's house. It's not a necessary buy. From that perspective, because there's a lot of terrific whiskeys for $40, $50, $60. But anyway, I was really impressed with Canadian Club 41. I think they did a great job. I loved last year's 40 edition, but this year's is just completely blowout as far as kind of a unique flavor profile and just the range of flavor you get and that intensity you get in this whiskey. So anyway, that's my quick review. If you want to read the full one, it's on whiskey.buzz. Thank you for watching. Cheers.